Please give a very warm welcome on the topic of the art of masturbation to Dr Sam Ladkin.
Yeah, this will be a lot less fun probably than you imagine. I was kind of intrigued to think about this subject when the topic of inspiration was brought up, so that's my excuse. I also was quite intrigued about collaborating with Alan Pacey, one of the other academics who was nominated, who's the person in charge of the sperm bank. I thought we might be able to really up his productivity, but it seems oddly inappropriate. This is a lecture with a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of poetry and a little bit of the other, probably. And some of it's more difficult and less engaging, probably, than you'd hoped for. So I apologise for that. But if you want to walk out, do. You're very welcome to. Hopefully you'll stick with me. I think you'll all agree that incidents of masturbation have reached epidemic proportions. Though, of course, I spare each and every one of you from the vulgar accusation. Your innocence of self-pollution is presumed. We might be able to understand the epidemic of masturbation by other people by considering the proliferation of pornography since the age of its technological reproducibility. I want, though, to suggest the inverse, that we can know just how widespread masturbation was by studying how vehemently it was denounced. And the key works in that tradition belong to the 18th century, namely Onania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution, of around 1712, and Tissot's bestseller Onanism, published in 1760. And these texts inaugurated an industry of anti-onanist propaganda, part of the sweeping medicalization of the morality of people's bodies, that is, the control of people's bodies and their actions by the state and by the interests of capital. According to these works, masturbation didn't just lead to blindness or even to hell, it led often to death. And until death, it led people to spend money on cures. We can understand this profiteering from panic in the terms of Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment. The more the light of reason sought to uncover, the greater the counter-history, and the prohibition on masturbation was one symptom decried by such luminaries as Rousseau, Voltaire, and Kant. So, masturbation has a history. Foucault documented the history of sexuality, and recent works have documented the history of masturbation, which itself is various, and tells us much about the morals, economics, art of particular times and places. And broadly speaking, very, very quickly, we can see the following phases in a Western tradition. There's little sense of the prohibition against masturbation in ancient Greece. The odd stories, such as Diogenes masturbating in public, suggest some shame was attached, but it seems more frowned upon and mocked than prohibited. Mocked as the recourse of the poor, or the ugly, or the otherwise disfavoured. There are several mythological tales of the fecundity of spilt seed and the story of Pan, who, despairing at his sexual frustration in lust with a nymph Echo, was taught to masturbate by his father Hermes, and that Pan consequently taught the shepherds such simple relief. And I think there's something to be said about that story in the origins of pastoral verse. The Christian tradition largely prohibited masturbation as a version of sodomitical wasted seed. So the real sin of masturbation was to fail to provide for the prohibition of procreation, an argument that's carried forth into the Catholic Church's persistence in outlawing condoms, for example. In the 18th century, we have the high point of its prohibition, as I mentioned above, inflected as it was by Christian doctrine. And then, to skip to the late 20th century, building on the brilliant work of Alfred Kinsey and Havelock Ellis, amongst others, we meet a radical lesbian aesthetic, masturbation as a kind of cause célèbre in the literature of feminine emancipation, feminist emancipation, associated with knowing oneself and loving oneself. And the landmark texts here include Our Bodies, Ourselves by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective and Betty Dodson's 1974 Liberating Masturbation, a Meditation on Self-Love. Okay, back to Foucault. One thing to distrust is the tendency to relate the question of homosexuality to the problem of who am I and what is the secret of my desire. Perhaps it would be better to ask oneself what relation through homosexuality can be established, invented, multiplied, and modulated. We might ask, furthermore, and against its pejorative use, what relations through masturbation can be established, invented, multiplied, and modulated. Why might the reception history of masturbation prove revelatory of some of the contradictions of modernity? How might masturbation theory, rather than queer theory, generate alternative models of productivity, that is, be compellingly unproductive, not simply disregarded as paradigmatic of solipsism? Its imaginative address might be fundamental to other kinds of affectionate presence and even sociability. So this is a kind of research project of inventing a field of masturbation theory, for which I will not become famous. A Poetics of Onanism. Thesis is my core argument. Lyric poetry is onanistic. Masturbation is the latent content of lyric poetry. Both lyric and masturbation are frequently imaginative flights devoted to absent lovers or forbidden others. Both are withdrawn seductions. Both are infused by the commonsensical notion that this action might better be replaced by having the loved one in hand, but might more realistically sometimes be a preference pretending to be a lack. Both are concerned with the dynamics between imagination, representation, and reality. Both are arts of pleasure. Both are defined against a history of queerness. Both are forms of address. We can think of several works of poetry that represent masturbation, famously in the work of Rochester or Richard Lovelace's Lucasta of 1659. A masturbatory dream of death and dissection, which, like a number of such fantasies, is fueled by the erotic imagery of Christ's suffering. Now on my down I'm tossed as on a wave, and my repose is made my grace. Fluttering I lie, do beat myself and die, but for a resurrection from your eye. My argument, though, is more pervasive than this representational sense. It suggests that there's an unacknowledged masturbatory imaginary, or at least an energy derived from masturbatory fantasy inherent to the lyric tradition. Let's go back to Petrarch, the inspiration for the love sonnet as it was taken up by Surrey and Wyatt and later Shakespeare. Petrarch dedicates his perennially adolescent talents to Laura, his recalcitrant love, endlessly refusing his most sweeping of seductive manipulations. And just a brief moment of this. Her speech and face and eyes, they so please me that I have them before my eyes, and I will always have them there, wherever I am, whether on hill or at the shore. And I think there's something of the masturbatory imaginary in there, a sense of lyric timelessness associated with the possibility of always seeing the loved one. There's a lot written about lyric time, and I'll come back to that. But think here of the play of tenses. Petrarch's voice is remembering the image of the loved one and or imagining remembering the loved one and or imagining a future in which it will have been possible to have remembered the loved one. The masturbatory imagination plays on the deferral between past, present, and future, between fantasy and memory, fantasies of memory, and fantasies of futurity. The lyric has been energized by this onanistic imagination. It seeks traditionally to seduce, or at least plays on seduction as a trope. We can think of masturbatory fantasy too as a disposition to seduction, but this time withdrawn from the real circuits of communication. Masturbation is a kind of knowingly failed seduction, which imagines each and every one of its seductions to be successful. The masturbator always gets the fantasized object of affection, unless, perhaps, they have particularly acute issues of self-confidence. By withdrawing from the presence of real seduction into its fiction, the masturbator takes on the power to move the object of their affections. And there are 2 points to make on this. Firstly, this is arguably a contention of poetry more generally. The poet and the masturbator frequently make the tacit assumption that the subjects in their representations not only can be dispersed by their imagination, but also that they wish to be so dispersed, at least within the aesthetic logic of the fantasy. Lyric and masturbation participate in a dream of licensed exploitation, an imaginative use of other people and their bodies. And furthermore, such exploitation typically imagines those people to want to be so used. Is such exploitation, the rapaciousness of the poetic imagination, demonstrable not only libidinally in the lyric, but also prevalent in poetry more generally, and in different ways according to the strictures of different genres? Does poetry participate in or reenact the exploitation of other persons in warfare, in the epic, or in work, in the Georgic? And perhaps dream that those persons so desire their own exploitation, or find their exploitation natural or inevitable? Secondly, we might ask, why, when choosing to disperse the bodies of others in the imagination, does the poet so frequently choose to fail in their seductions? Petrarch's erotic thrill is, I suggest, dependent on her chastity. It is not masturbatory simply because she refuses to leave his imagination and enter his life, but because her refusal causes some kind of excitement. Sex so often enjoys transgression, and her chastity somehow fuels his ardour. In his book on the relations between anatomical dissection and the traditions of the lyric blazon, the blazon tends to be where you praise typically a woman's body by metaphorically cutting it up in all sorts of parts and praising each part in turn. There's an implicit violence involved in the blazon. Jonathan Saudet describes the way the dispersal of the female figure becomes a pretense for the homosocial contestation between male poets. And yet, so many of the blazons describe a cruel mistress who ultimately rejects the advances of the poet-lover. The blazon acts as self-abasement, a kind of prostration before the power of beauty of the violently anatomized and dispersed female form. The onanism of the blazon is also, therefore, masochistic. Why, when imagining what you want, imagine your failure, thus throwing the blazon back from the seductions of love poetry to masturbation as the recourse of self-loathing? As Saudet writes, why is she so cruel, he asks, in a fit of self-abnegation? The answer, of course, is because he has made her so, in a generic rather than actual sense. Perhaps we need to attend to a split poetics of onanism, one which withdraws from the imagined successes of seduction into consolatory self-pleasure, and the other which allows its desire to overwhelm the opposition of alterity, of the other, of otherness. And I'll get on to another example now. So this is about the great American poet Walt Whitman. If lyric is tied into a tradition of onanism, then Walt Whitman is its greatest exponent. Michael Moon, in Disseminating Whitman, a very key title, in Disseminating Whitman, attends to his comparison of the male body with the socio-political body of the US by focusing on the term constitution. Such a conflation is made by Thomas Paine in his comparison of the potential of the US in 1776 to that of an adolescent body. Youth is the seed time of good habits, as well as in nations as in individuals. And Moon comments, what is merely analogical in Paine became reified in the 19th century into a national preoccupation with the waste of America's seed, meaning both the country's promise and potential and the reproductive secretions of its male citizens. So there was this kind of crazy concern about the economics of the US as a kind of wastefulness, and you needed to instead conduct good husbandry and not waste your capital or indeed your seed. America's productive constitution had to be defended from the self-abuse committed in adolescence. Moon's argument is that Whitman's own adolescence and the height of the anti-onanist discourse in the US were historically contiguous. How does this discourse pervade Whitman's work? One of his tropes is to make of the offering of the book itself to the reader a gift carrying libidinal desire, and in doing so he frequently includes masturbatory fantasies. The I of the poem offers to worship its own seed-spilling, confusing as it does the relation of I to you. I'm just going to run through a few examples from Whitman's work. If I worship one thing more than another, it shall be the spread of my own body or any part of it. Translucent mould of me, it shall be you. You, my rich blood, your milky stream, pale strippings of my life. I dote on myself, there is that lot of me, and all so luscious. Or, I talk wildly, I have lost my wits, I and nobody else and the greatest traitor. I went myself first to the headland, my own hands carried me there. For Whitman, hearing the voice of a soprano convulses me like the climax of my love grip. We can also find a description of the pulse pounding through the veins of the hand, both the penis, the young man, in the palm of the hand, and as a book with its comparable quality of virile rhythm. The young man that wakes deep at night, the hand seeking to repress what would master him, the pulse pounding through palms and trembling encircling fingers, the young man all coloured, red, ashamed, angry. The penis may, however, be less potently angry. In Bunch Poem or Spontaneous Me, we read, this poem, drooping, shy, and unseen, that I always carry, and that all men carry. The fantasy of touching another body is extended through the medium of the book. Who touches this book touches a man. And we find an echo of the story of Onan. My little books were beginnings, they were the ground into which I dropped the seed. The ground, analogous to the material of the book, becomes the receptacle for supposedly wasted seed, proving queerly fecund, sprouting the poems. Whitman's dream appears to be of a limitless and excessive potency, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling overwhelming the decorum of the conventional poetic line. Give me exhaustless, make me a fountain, that I exhale love from me wherever I go, like a moist perennial dew, for the ashes of all dead soldiers south or north. Such excessive generosity is onanistic seed to be spilt on the territory of the Civil War dead. For whom does Whitman's poetry masturbate, and why? One of the arguments here is about the kind of fear of masturbation as potentially limitless. So on the one hand, there's a real concern about always being careful with your libidinal energies, and on the other hand, the worry is that once you start dispersing your own energy, there's no end to it. It could just carry on. And indeed, that was the kind of mythic reason why eventually you'd collapse and die. And as you're collapsing and dying, intriguingly, there's a very strong correlation between the way in which descriptions of homosexuality and queerness in the 19th century worked and descriptions of the kind of ever more inverted and frail masturbator. So there's a connection. Alan Grossman describes Whitman's Poetics of Acknowledgement. The poem is of the same nature as Central Value because the whole function of its discourse is acknowledgement. Consequently, universal access to the poem is a policy to overcome scarcity. So this is a feature of Whitman's work. He's constantly acknowledging people in other kinds of work, people of other kinds of races, all sorts of sense of taking everyone into the democratic vision of America. To overcome scarcity, Whitman seeks not heterosexual procreation, but inexhaustible generosity. Grossman writes that acknowledgement had to be based on a lavish dispersal of sentiment, the establishment of a new basis of speaking in the counter-logic and infinite distributability of affectionate presence. Grossman mistakes such enunciations of affection for a poetics of presence when its presence is fundamentally onanistic. So this is where I'm disagreeing with Grossman's position. Whitman, the master of union as social love, can achieve such generosity not by being a love poet in its traditional sense, that is, as a seductive presence where there is failure or success, but rather by understanding the social love available to masturbation. Masturbation without consent requires no rhetoric of seduction, only the ambivalent generosity of enunciation and the declaration of affection. So my argument at this point is that the way in which masturbation mediates presence with absence is understood by the deconstruction of Derrida. If I have time, I'll describe how what Whitman understands implicitly is taken on more fully by a contemporary poet called Rob Halpin in his 2012 book entitled Music for Porn. Music for Porn is a Derridian reading of Whitman's Civil War poems and is actually more fun than that description suggests. Okay. Bear with me. This gets pretty heavy, and there are very few jokes. So just hang in there, and it'll lighten up in a little while. So don't panic. It doesn't get very light actually, but I thought I'd say that so you give it a go. Okay. So recall my description of Petrarchan time. The imaginative exploitation of a sexual fantasy involves the expression of the past of the masturbating subject, the reason a particular figure of lust is chosen, and the aspirant longing of the future actually having that figure, but knowing too that there can be no easy shift from longing through imagining to having, that masturbation is a particular kind of longing, expecting itself to be aspirant, but fundamentally engaged, if ever fundamentally estranged, if ever approached in reality. The absence of the fantasy to the presence of the fantasists insists on the absence of the fantasist from the reality of the fantasy. And there's not time to explain the philosophy of Jacques Derrida to you, sadly, though I could expertly if I wanted to. And I'm aware that Derrida is taken to be a bit of an onanist by some people, so we'll just try and carry on anyway. His philosophy, though, is involved in overturning certain hierarchical oppositions. He argues for a stage in which one side of an opposition, which is currently prioritized over another, will be overturned. This new hierarchy will then also be shown to be flawed and ungrounded, and will be able to move on to a next phase, which involves the dissolution of such hierarchies. So, for example, traditionally male is taken to have some conceptual priority over female, nature is presumed prior to and privileged over culture, being over nothing, presence over absence. And here we're going to look at the way masturbation might allow us to overturn the play of presence and absence, nature and culture, and to introduce another of these hierarchies, sex and masturbation. Is it masturbation rather than procreative sex that should have conceptual and temporal priority? Is sex a supplement to masturbation rather than the other way round? So one seminal moment of post-structuralist thought is the account of that dangerous supplement in Derrida's Of Grammatology. The section is nothing less than an interpretation of modern humanity as onanist. Modern man has, according to Derrida, been mistaken in his metaphysics by a deluded fidelity to presence, an ontological error to which he has been attached as though to a lover. That is, modern man has been attached to presence, including self-presence, presence to oneself, in proportion to his shame and guilt at being a secret masturbator, a fantasist dependent on the absence of the object of affection. Presence, attachment to the loved one, and absence, the loss of the loved one, are mediated ambivalently in the figure of the masturbator, imagining presence in absence, requiring absence from presence, and, importantly, fetishizing pleasure in absence as shame. So shame is a kind of a motor or generator for this particular kind of modern desire. Modern man is libidinally charged by shame at masturbation and philosophically inspired to revere presence as shame's antidote. The more reprehensible self-harm, the fiercer the attachment to a metaphysics of presence. Derrida's critique of presence is played out on the figure of the masturbator. Self-sufficient, present to themselves, immanently in and of their experience, still depends on the powers of representation, and imagination, mediating the past which their libido expresses and the future to which their desire aspires. So even in the most sort of self-present of activities, you're still dependent on memory and aspiration. You're still not immediate to yourself. Derrida's account refers back to the contradictory legacy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in whose autobiographical truth-telling can be revealed modern man's agonism over onanism. The coinage dangerous supplement is Rousseau's. The dangerous supplement mediates between and exceeds the fault between a natural and a cultural order. Masturbation cheats nature, refusing it the possibility of procreation, instead miring the self in the inevitability of decay due to the expending of the body's vital substances. Rousseau's anguish is evidence of the anti-onanist epidemic. Modern man was born with the thoroughly modern and universal engine for generating guilt, shame, and anxiety, onanism. Behind Rousseau's fidelity to nature, the natural order is sex not only as the immanence of action with desire, that is, without the mediation of representation. So here the argument is that in sex there's no imaginative or fantasy life, there is only the immediacy of sex, the activity of it in a sort of state of immanence, of presence. Though it shouldn't be that quick. Okay. The natural order is sex not only as the immanence of action with desire, but also the promise that coition is linked inexorably to reproduction. Okay? Pornography, as the inspiration for onanistic dispersal, the failure to utilize the male seed for procreation, is against nature in a particular way. It is a deferral of procreation that antagonizes the logic of reproduction with that of representation. So reproduction and representation. Pornography is representation, even when it's real, whereas sex is reproductive. So nature is procreative, whereas culture is merely representational. Derrida plays on that hierarchy by reading speech as natural, as self-presence, as a lack of mediation of thought. You're always supposedly in the immediacy of your thoughts in speech. Whereas writing is closer to this loss of immediacy. It's representational. It represents things out in the world rather than something that's present. Simply that you can refer to something that's not in your immediate vicinity. The supplement to speech and the supplement which threatens to replace speech, much like masturbation threatens to replace sex, is writing. There's a handy diagram. Where writing is dangerous from the moment that representation there claims to be presence and the sign of the thing itself, so pornography is dangerous from the moment its supplementarity to a natural sex life threatens either to replace it, to supersede it, or to make its imaginative or representational artifice necessary to it. The supplement is dangerous because where it promises to fill a lack, it also threatens to exceed the fullest measure of presence. The crisis for Rousseau is one of the imagination. Committed to presence and self-presence as concordance with nature, the interminable desire for other presences by summoning, and his words, by summoning absent beauties is perversion. And perversion from genital ablation from procreation is sin. The seduction of oneself by imagining other absent presences is the displacement of self-presence. Rousseau writes, affecting oneself by another presence, one corrupts oneself by oneself. And as Derrida comments, Rousseau neither wishes to think nor can think that this alteration does not simply happen to the self, that it is the self's very origin. So for Derrida, there's always a fundamental kind of alienation within the idea of your own presence to yourself. The alienated self-consciousness of modern man is born of the corruption of oneself in the fantasy of autoeroticism. The experience of absent presences in and to oneself is a fundamental structure of subjectivity, an integral alienation from self-presence necessary to all sociability. And I propose lyric to be similarly this kind of representation of oneself to oneself that is necessary to a model of sociability. I'll ask actually that this be put up online for you to go back to and have a look at. I'll just skip over it for now. So the masturbator engages in an act of procuration. Derrida, in this quotation, playing on the etymological history of procuration that includes the obtainment of women as prostitutes. Language, therefore, for Derrida is pornographic, writing prostitution in its imaginative procuration of an absent presence. And it's that Derridean sense of pornographic, onanistic language taken on by Rob Halpin's latest collection, Music for Porn. The second section of Music for Porn goes under a pornotopian title, Imaginary Politics. It opens with this pathos of distance being a thing inside him once I felt. Its opening innuendo, arriving by night in sleeves to drape the need, leads into a meditation on loss and the particular kind of distance or absence of the onanistic imagination. There's shame in simply being here, the suffering of distance transformed in the fantasy of imagining being a thing inside you, but remaining thing-like, an object, before the grammar loops around to the beginning of this onanistic circle. I felt this pathos of distance, being a thing inside him once I felt. The text worries at the ejaculatory shudder with no reference, the absent object of lust, or in this case, and this is an updating of Whitman's Civil War poems. So this is about a particular fantasy figure of a soldier, a male soldier, in most likely in and out of Iraq, Afghanistan. Okay. George Katib describes the effective model for Whitman to be that of sexual cruising, and what's taken as cruising might better be described as the summoning of masturbatory intensities, imagining love more than holding love's reply. We should ask then what sociability remains in onanism. Is it simply solipsistic? Whether, in fact, sociability is the supplement to onanism. Where Whitman's splendour is in the generosity of affection, sadly inaugurating, not that he was to know this, but forms of domination by the American democracy he loved, Halpin withdraws into the implicit otherness of the lyric masturbator. He is writing from the other end of the American empire. This otherness intrinsic to solitude remains a model of relationality. And what does it mean to turn towards someone in onanistic fantasy? So I'm going to link here onanism finally to a literary trope, the idea of apostrophe, and the idea of, if you're, in rhetorical terms, if you're speaking to a group of people, you could turn within that group to one particular or several people, or more generally when you turn towards an object or a force. So we might, as poets, you might address the west wind, or you might address a Grecian urn, or whatever it is. So that's an apostrophe. It means an aside. Alan Grossman's diagnosis of Whitman, Whitmanian acknowledgement. So this moves to the conclusion, so keep going. Alan Grossman's diagnosis of Whitmanian acknowledgement relies on a notion often considered necessary to lyric, that of the voice, and in particular the way the voice offers, for him, the bestowal of presence across time, and the theatre of that presence is the poetic line. Halpin's onanistic poetics belongs to such a lyric tradition, but where Whitman's poetics of acknowledgement promises presence, Halpin's alienated version is the deconstruction of absence in presence, symbolised by the lyric poet as masturbator. Halpin's deconstruction of Whitmanian presence with the implicit voice of poetic song turned to its representation in written form, that is as pornography, is helpful, therefore, in drawing out the onanistic absence necessary to Whitman's generous acknowledgement. Against Grossman, Whitman's Poetics of acknowledgement is energized by the supplement of masturbation over the bestowal of presence. And I'll go through that again, so don't panic. Onanism is the deconstruction of address. Lyric is consistently concerned with various kinds of apostrophe, turns to or within an audience, turns to the reader, turns to an object or concept. Consider the following from Jonathan Culler's brilliant exposition of apostrophe. So these are some of the features of apostrophe in poetry as he sees them. Firstly, apostrophe serves as an intensifier. And basically I'm arguing that there's something about these descriptions that we can apply to onanism. As images of invested passion. Secondly, and more importantly, though Culler does not make apostrophe essential to a definition of lyric, he does suggest it's pervasive and ultimately that the lyric is characteristically the triumph of the apostrophic over the narrative. So it's typically expression or self-expression over storytelling and narrative. Thirdly, apostrophe makes its point by troping not on the meaning of a word but on the circuit or situation of communication itself. Apostrophe offers, therefore, a kind of communicative self-reflexivity, a self-fashioning of the poet by addressing the reader or something in lieu of the reader. So even when you're trying to communicate with some external, outside person or world, there's a sense in which you're fashioning yourself, your own identity. Apostrophe tropes on the situation of communication itself, and masturbation is a form of address to a figure of desire, a reader that incorporates its own failure. Consider the example Culler takes from Northrop Frye's The Anatomy of Criticism, with reference to John Stuart Mill's aphorism, "The lyric is not heard but overheard." The lyric poet normally pretends to be talking to himself or to someone else, a spirit of nature, a muse, a personal friend, a lover, a god, a personified abstraction, or a natural object. The poet, so to speak, turns his back on his listeners. So I'm thinking about the privacy of this act. When a love lyric attempts, partly because lyric often pretends it doesn't have a readership, it pretends it's speaking only to itself. When a love lyric attempts to seduce the subject of its affections, and by doing so seduces its reader, its apostrophe has been turned in a way that is denied by its address. The longed-for presence of the desired other is turned to the presence of the reader, overhearing the address intended ostensibly elsewhere. So the reader is in a sort of, I think, an uncomfortable position here, somehow overhearing the fantasies of the poet. The act, though of course the poet really is writing to the reader frequently. The act of onanism encapsulates the failure of apostrophic address of the lyric poet and the pleasure taken therein. If the theatre of that lyric presence is the poetic line, then the stage is empty but for the poet, his or her back to us, embarrassing us with the candour of his or her hopes. Lyric as onanistic apostrophe, a self-reflexive address honouring its subject. The apostrophe that for Grossman is evidence of the vocative, which itself is evidence of presence, is, for Culler, part of the prospective aspiration of lyric. To apostrophise is to will a state of affairs, to attempt to call it into being by asking inanimate objects to bend themselves to your desire. In these terms, the function of apostrophe would be to make the objects of the universe potentially responsive forces. Halpin's poetry invokes, not with such strength, but with models of weakened affect. There isn't time to go into it, unfortunately, but what he conceptualizes as patiency mixes an idea of temporal patience, being patient, and the idea of the kind of weakness of being a hospital patient, for example. And patiency is about openness, vulnerability, describable in terms of queer affect, queer emotional states, that seeks to avoid mastering animate objects by will alone. So for Culler, the apostrophe is supposed to be where you take on and dominate the Western wind or something like it, whereas Halpern wants to, in some sense, be patient, be weakened before these things. So, moving in a halo of shame, the love of a militiaman, democracy's soul, a thing that fails to happen, suspended in this mindless blow, incalculable interval where we almost make contact with the present, singing in the fault of our temporal divide, who will have been here to hear this? Mon petit soldat, mon semblable, your touch makes me other than the meat I am. Peter Coviello argues that virtually every strand of Whitman's utopian thought devolves upon and is anchored by an unwavering belief in the capacity of strangers to recognize, desire, and be intimate with one another. Complicity in distant harm, for Halpern, in Iraq or in Afghanistan, may require greater powers of intimacy to overcome. But for Halpern, the strong voice, what he talks about as the martial music of Whitman, that in works like Drum Taps that seem very fervently in favour of war, essentially. So the complicity in distant harm, in distant wars, in the predation on other countries on behalf of empire, may require even greater powers of intimacy to overcome. But for Halpern, the strong voice meets a lesser music. In Derrida's words, the différance without which the desire of presence as such would not find its breathing space. This is about non-satisfaction of onanistic desire that's necessary for Halpern to hope. Okay, thanks very much.